She stood behind the counter, never taking her eyes off the tap water, which poured incessantly, filling the plates and cups that were endlessly piling up in her hands. Every movement she made was automatic. She hardly noticed how her hands were being worn away by the constant contact with detergent and hot water. Cracks appeared, pockets of pain on the skin, but she just kept working, without asking questions and without hopes. All those endless hours she spent washing dishes had become a part of her life. Her hands looked like tools that had lost their meaning, but continued to fulfill their role, just like she did. She had lost her chance for happiness many years ago, and now everything was reduced to one continuous routine. She knew she had no right to dream. Every day was another portion of uncertainty, and her future seemed to be something that would just dissolve in this space where she was just a small element of the system, nothing more. Most of the people who came to the cafe didn't even notice her. They were busy doing their own thing, and she was busy doing hers. Her life was a continuous struggle for trifles, and all that remained were the memories of a childhood that was forever distant and dreams that never came true. Her childhood. She rarely remembered it because there was nothing to remember. She was brought up in foster care, and although she received basic care, it was not like a family. They weren't her real parents, and none of her caregivers were even close to what her real family could have been. And most importantly, her real parents never came into her life. They left her when she was a child and have not been heard from since. It seems like it was so long ago that time has erased their names from her memory. She was unnecessary, abandoned, not sought after. And here, in this cheap cafe, where her world was limited to the smell of coffee and loud conversations at the tables, she lived, working for minimum wage. Her workday was endless hours at the sink, and her only hope was the evening, when she could close the cafe door and go home to wake up and do it all over again. But this day was different. When he walked in, her attention was involuntarily drawn to him. He looked completely different from all the other clients. He was well dressed, with an expensive watch on his wrist, but what was more striking was his calmness. His confidence in every step stood out against the background of the other, less sophisticated visitors to the cafe. He was not in a hurry, his movements were smooth, like a person who had long been accustomed to having everything under control. Her gaze couldn't help but rest on him, and although she tried not to show too much curiosity, her intuition told her that he was no ordinary customer. There was a depth to his gaze that contrasted so sharply with all the other faces she saw every day. She felt as if she had seen him somewhere before. Why does this man seem so familiar? This strange feeling did not let go of her. He went to the cash register and ordered a cup of coffee, taking out his wallet to pay. She stood closer to the sink as before, trying not to pay attention to what was happening, but her heart started to beat faster when the man's wallet fell out of his hands and rolled across the floor. She looked up, of course, but immediately saw him bend down to pick it up. But what happened was that something else fell out of the wallet as if from an empty pocket. And it was a photograph. A childhood photo covered in the yellow of time. Surprisingly, she instantly recognized herself in it. The same big eyes, freckles on her nose, and the small smile she used to smile as a child, standing on the threshold of her former home. It was her photo. How is this possible? Why was this man carrying her picture? She bent down, trying to pick it up, but for some reason she couldn't take her eyes off the picture. Everything turned inside her. Her heart was pounding, and her breathing became rapid. Who was this man? Why his wallet and her childhood photo? What did this have to do with her past, which she had tried so hard to forget? Could it be just a coincidence, or was there something more? She leaned her head over the photo, which sparkled with its yellow, old-fashioned color amidst the modern clutter of her wallet. Her heart was beating frantically in her chest, as if trying to break through walls built of boundless sadness and pain. In this crumpled, yellowed photo, she saw herself a little girl with bright eyes that shone with the light of innocence, and the same mole that had always been a symbol of her uniqueness. She stood there, unable to take her eyes off this small piece of the past. Everything was burning inside her, a mixture of pain, curiosity, and distrust, spreading like a raging flame that could not be extinguished. She had seen herself in the mirror so many times, but she had never remembered her own story, and now she saw it reflected in this photo, as if to symbolize that her whole life had been only fragments of an unknown truth. He, the same man who had been picking up her wallet a few minutes earlier, tilted his head slightly, noticing her expression, and for a moment his eyes met hers. But he did not understand the reason for her emotional state. His face remained unchanged, almost indifferent, as if he could not realize that she was the one he had so often remembered with sadness when looking at this photo. She held the photo out to him, but her mind could not accept a simple explanation. How could it be that this man, whose presence had caused her such inner turmoil, was wearing it? Every cell in her body questioned all the indisputable truth she knew about herself, about her past, about her supposedly broken childhood spent in foster care, where love was always a luxury unavailable to those who remained lonely and forgotten. The memory of her childhood came to her in sharp, painful flashes. She remembered the cold nights in foster homes where she was just a small shadow running around the rooms, unable to receive true love. No one wanted her, no one was looking for her, and her real parents remained unknown, like a blank page in her life. All of this made her feel unwanted, devoid of identity, like an integral part of a dark history that remained beyond her understanding. She felt the urge to find out more, to find out who this man was and why he was carrying a part of her past in his belongings. It seemed that every cell in her body was striving to reveal secrets, even if they might be too painful to accept. Her inner voice, which had always silently pushed her toward the truth, finally woke up. She knew she could no longer remain in the darkness of her own doubts. The next morning, before sunrise, she sat down at her computer in a small internet cafe that smelled of fresh coffee beans and cold air conditioning. Her fingers quickly typed in the name she had found on the credit card she had seen in the man's wallet. The search results stunned her: Richard Grayson, a name that immediately evoked associations with luxury and power. He was a wealthy businessman, the owner of large companies, a man whose reputation seemed unshakable, but who had always remained in the shadows because of his secrecy. All these years, his name was mentioned in articles, interviews, and news. He was an influential person whom people saw only through the prism of his success. The obscurity and poverty of her life contrasted with the luxury that Richard Grayson symbolized. She imagined him walking around in shiny offices, where everything sparkled with cleanliness and order, where every detail was polished to perfection, and next to him was her, whose fate was filled with only hardship and hopelessness. And it was this contrast, this difference in worlds, that filled her with inner pain and a desire to know the truth. She walked a few blocks, decisively approaching a large building in the city center. Richard Grayson's office was on the top floor, and the building itself stood like a monolith wrapped in expensive architecture. She grabbed a rag and mop from a nearby shop, came up with a plan, and entered through the back door as a cleaning lady. Her heart was beating faster, but she forced herself to remain calm. The elevator ride up to his office, the long corridors, the spacious reception area, it all looked alien, luxurious, and out of her reach. She was not prepared for what awaited her. She felt like a small part of this big world, but internally she was trying to pull herself together. All these years of fighting for every day could not go to waste. She started cleaning, trying not to attract attention. But suddenly he came in. Richard Grayson. Tall, elegantly dressed, with expressive features. His gaze was interested at first, but then settled on her. He pulled his hands out of his pockets and froze in place, as if he had realized something. His eyes rested on her face, and then familiar features appeared in his gaze. He asked her name, but she couldn't answer right away, her heart was beating wildly. And he, as if sensing it, offered to talk, seeing something familiar in her eyes. Their lives were completely different. She is an ordinary girl who fights for survival every day, who is used to ignoring her dreams to keep her head above water. He was a wealthy businessman who lived in luxury and carefree living, where every day seemed to promise more wealth and influence. But when their eyes met, she saw in his eyes the same thing she saw in hers, pain. Pain from something that could not be forgotten, that could not be lost. It was not just an accident. She could not keep silent any longer. All this time, she had been trying to understand why he had the photo. Why he had it. And how did she end up in his life? "Why do you have my picture?" she asked when her breathing finally became steady. Richard was silent for a moment. His gaze changed, and he looked surprised, as if startled by her question. Then he took a deep breath and began to speak. He told her that he had once loved a woman, her mother. They met many years ago, when she was still young. She was mysterious, beautiful, but there was always a sadness in her eyes that he could not understand. They were happy together, but then everything changed. Her mother left him suddenly, leaving him only this photo, his only memory of her. He searched for her for a long time, trying to find out what had happened, but he couldn't. Their connection was severed, and he could not find her, although he promised himself that he would search until he found her. But it was to no avail. When he saw her, something inside him began to change. That look, that face, it was like a mirror from the past. And there she was, standing in front of him. His daughter, whom he had been looking for all this time. She was listening to his words, and she was torn inside. How could he? How could he just lose her, not know where she was? She couldn't believe it. How could you not know that your child was around for so long? How could you just leave her? But at the same time, she realized that he was also suffering from the same pain as her. He was searching, but was he really searching the right way? Her heart was filled with doubts. And she realized one thing, now they were both trapped in the past. Their meeting was not just a coincidence. It was the beginning of something big that she couldn't yet understand, but her life would never be the same. She tried to run away from him, but her own heart betrayed her. He was her father, though she was not ready to believe it. Pain and anger mingled in her chest, and every word he said felt like a betrayal, even though she couldn't explain why. She pushed him away, but inside, a part of her didn't want to give up, didn't want to forget his face, which had now become part of her own pain. Richard sat in front of her, his hands clasped on the table. His eyes were full of longing, and his voice sounded desperate as he began to tell her more than she was ready to hear. The shadow of his past still hung over him like a dark cloud that never dissipated. "Your mother. She didn't leave me for nothing," he said, glancing at the photo on the table between them. His voice was heavy and his eyes were lost. There was something more than just separation. She was forced to run away. There was a man. His name was Martin Drake. The name of this man sounded like thunder, tearing her heart to pieces. Martin Drake. She had never heard of him, but now his name was in her life, like a ghost that appeared at the most unexpected moments. He was part of what happened to her mother, part of what kept her in the dark. He was involved with my business, Richard continued, and she could see the shadow of that name weighing on his words. At first, it seemed like a simple business rivalry, but then I realized he was more than just a competitor. He had power over us, and not just financial power. Martin was involved in dirty deeds that were not just about money. She could not believe her ears. Her mother was having an affair with a man who dabbled in the dark side of life. How could this have happened? And what did it have to do with her? Richard said that Martin was the person who made her mother run away, hide and leave him. He threatened her, more than once, and every day she became more and more vulnerable to his manipulations. Martin Drake was the one who made her run away, who took away all hope from me. Richard's voice became firm, but it still had a broken tone. But even that didn't save her. I tried to find you, but I didn't have time. Your mother was dead and the last hope of finding you was lost. And here, in his words, she found something she had not expected. His beloved, her mother, was dead. He was never able to save her. Martin left his mark on their lives. He destroyed everything that could have been. Richard was silent, his eyes clouded over, and her heart was filled with anger and sadness. How could this be true? How could she believe that her mother lived in a world where death and betrayal were so closely intertwined? She stood up from her seat, her hand trembling as she pushed back her chair, her gaze still locked on him. You want me to believe that? She asked with clenched teeth. Her voice sounded sharp, but she couldn't find answers to her questions. I can't change what happened, but you have to understand that I've been looking for you for years, Richard said, his voice weak. You have to believe that I didn't want this, didn't want to lose you the way I lost her. She felt wounded. Her heart was beating so hard that every beat reverberated in her chest. She couldn't listen to those words anymore. She felt that every sentence he said deepened the pain, every word became another wound in her soul. How could he be so helpless? How could he leave her where she was, not realizing what was really happening? She turned away and walked away. The pain in her heart was so intense that every step seemed incredibly difficult. She didn't want to listen to him anymore, didn't want to see his face anymore. But, despite all this, something remained unfinished in her soul, as if she was on the verge of some deep truth that had yet to be found. She knew it was not over yet. After she learned about her true origin and that her father was alive, life became a different reality for her. All those years spent in deception and ignorance immediately changed her perception of everything around her. She tried to return to her usual, albeit difficult, life. But now it seemed impossible. She couldn't just walk away and forget. This news, the disclosure of the past, these terrible details about her father that appeared in her mind, did not give her peace. Every day the past was getting closer. She felt that every attempt to let go of it, to start over, inevitably brought her back. One day, walking along her usual streets after work, she noticed that she was being followed. At first it was unnoticeable, but then it became obvious. That evening, when she was walking home, she was met by two strangers. They were not aggressive, but their gaze was cold and determined. One of them came closer to her and said, "Stay away from this man. You don't know what Martin Drake is capable of." Her heart beat faster. She recognized the name. Martin Drake was the man who had started it all. This name was no longer just an image from the past, but a real enemy who had influenced her entire life. "Are you trying to intimidate me?" she asked, trying to remain calm. But the stranger's face showed no emotion. He just smiled with such cold calculation that had no place in a world where real human feelings reigned. "We don't want to scare you. But you have to understand that if you don't leave this now, your life will be in real danger. Martin is not someone to play with." They weren't just threatening her. She quickly realized that if they found her, it meant one thing. The past had come back to her with all its cruelty. And now it would not let go. Her father was also in danger. All these years, trying to find her, he did not know what risks he was taking. And then one chance meeting changed everything, and now, when it seemed that happiness might return to their lives, someone didn't like it. Martin Drake may have thought that none of this mattered to him, but his reaction to the fact that Richard could be happy was not long in coming. He couldn't let him rebuild what had long since collapsed. She realized that their fates were now intertwined. Her father and she are two people who are looking for the truth, and all those who stand in their way are trying to destroy any possibility of happiness. They must face this threat together. The solution was obvious. They had to gather all their strength and confront Martin Drake, his business, his influence. She felt a tension in her heart. Their fight was just beginning. She and her father now had to walk the path of truth together, no matter how many enemies they met along the way. And although every step they took was like walking on a knife's edge, with the realization that time was running out and every moment could be decisive, they had no choice but to move forward. And now, as they prepared to confront Martin Drake, they realized that they would face even more challenges every day. But together they were ready for anything. It was a dark alleyway, a deafening night, and her heart was beating like a blood clot that heralded the final battle. She could feel it, she had not been kidnapped by chance. This time, they didn't just take her, they decided to take revenge, to make her father abandon her and forget about everything that had happened. He was their target, and they weren't going to let him be happy. She found herself in a minibus speeding through the night city, so fast that time seemed to stand still. The next thing she saw was a dark room where silence echoed. Meanwhile, he, her father, could not lose her again. He had given up everything. His business, his name, none of it mattered anymore. He had one goal, to get his daughter back. He must have realized this a long time ago, but now that everything was so close, when he found her, he was ready to give everything to save her. Once he got the information about where she was being held, he didn't hesitate. He set out with his security detail, a few of the best people he trusted. They arrived at the abandoned warehouse where she was being held. The guards stood at attention, ready to fight, and he was determined. It was a fight for his daughter, for her future. Leaving everything behind, he burst into the room. His guards resolutely neutralized everyone who stood in their way. All the enemies who tried to stop him did not stand a chance. His own pain was reflected in his every movement, and it gave him strength. "You can't take her," one of the enemy guards shouted when he saw him. But he was no longer afraid. He was ready for this fight. His eyes were full of determination, and he was not going to give up. After all, his every move and every step had one meaning, to save her. She was sitting in the corner, tied up. He burst into the room with several guards, ready to fight for her to the end. She could feel it. He had come for her, and now nothing could stop them. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Her father was here, he had not left her. Meanwhile, one of the last enemies, the one who remained alive, fired his last shot. The bullet went straight through his shoulder, and he remained on his feet, even though wounded. She shuddered in shock, but he mustered all his strength to get up. His men quickly dealt with the rest of the attackers. "You won't leave me?" she whispered, her hand touching his face. "Never," he answered, though he sighed painfully, his voice still holding the same confidence as before. Now they were together. The enemies were defeated, but the traces of this battle remained not only on their bodies. The scars of the past will not disappear. They will never be able to completely erase those painful moments when life tries to take away everything that is dear to you. But now, looking at her, he realized that these scars were no longer so important. They were part of who they had become. She finally realized that he had never left her. He was part of this struggle. He was also a victim of circumstances. She was not the only one who had experienced pain. He too had paid a high price, and now they had a chance to restore what had been lost. Moved, she helped him up, even though his pain was intense. They left together, leaving everything behind. Their story didn't end there, but they now knew that life offers chances even in the darkest moments. The happy ending was not easy, it was complicated and difficult. But they left this path behind, keeping the pain in their hearts that reminded them of the importance of each new step. Just as they were leaving for a new life, their eyes met. She saw something in his eyes that she hadn't seen for a long time, calmness, faith, and although there was still a bit of pain, it didn't stop them. They were starting a new life together. A life without lies, without the shadows of the past. They were a family, a real family, where every day was a new chance, a new story. And although this story had dark moments, together they were able to overcome everything.